Hello, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to History Undercover. The Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery includes an inscription, "Keeping Faith with America's Missing Servicemen." It was added in 1999, giving official recognition to thousands who were listed as missing in action. Our program reveals the ongoing efforts to track down MIAs, not only in Vietnam, but around the world. The U.S. spends more time and money than any other nation searching for its missing soldiers or for any clue that could remove even one name from the ranks of those still unaccounted for. Join us as History Undercover presents MIAs, Dead or Alive. The date, January 17th, 1991, the first day of Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf, aimed at forcing Iraq to give up Kuwait. 33-year-old Navy pilot Lieutenant Commander Michael Scott Spiker takes off from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga.
We were all probably very apprehensive, very frightened about that first night.
The squadron's mission is to knock out Saddam Hussein's surface-to-air defenses west of Baghdad. After firing off their last shots, the pilots check in.
Spike doesn't check in, so there's a relay between planes coming back to me, asking me, hey, just call for Spike. And I'm just keying the radio and calling for Spike. Just, Spike, I'll copy. Spike, skull. Spike, you got me?
But Lieutenant Hull receives no response. Spiker is missing. As the squadron begins returning to the aircraft carrier, the crew on board immediately knows that something has gone terribly wrong.
The first report was that we lost an airplane. It looked like it was a surface-to-air missile. Airplane disintegrated on impact, no contact with the pilot.
There have been casualties.
Because of the report, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney is quick to announce him killed in action at a news conference in Washington, D.C.
I don't know that we want to identify the aircraft, do we?
It was an F-18.
Was that a wound or a death?
A death.
I didn't care what the Secretary of Defense said. It was irrelevant to me. I clung on, as long as everyone else in the squadron, that Spiker was walking around in the desert doing his evasion maneuvers and would be rescued.
But because no one ever hears any radio transmissions from the downed pilot, the military makes no attempt to find Spiker.
If you're in heavily defended areas, you don't go unless, one, you know that the pilot's alive, you can communicate with him by whatever means, and that you've got a validation that it is the individual talking or communicating with you that you believe it is.
After the war ends, the Pentagon hopes it will learn more about Spiker's fate when Saddam Hussein releases 23 American POWs in Baghdad.
I was sent there as a possible escort for whether he was alive and repatriated or whether his remains were returned.
But Saddam says nothing about Michael Spiker's fate. However, about a month later, the Iraqis provide evidence that seems to support the Pentagon's contention that Spiker is dead.
They provided us 1.5 pounds of some flesh and hair that they said belonged to our jet pilot, Michael. We made the correlation that this was perhaps related to our missing pilot, Lieutenant Commander Michael Scott Spiker.
The remains go to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, the first laboratory in the world to use DNA testing to identify war dead.
It's from this tissue that we did our testing.
To determine if the tissue has indeed come from Lieutenant Commander Spiker, the lab does 2 types of DNA testing. One, mitochondrial DNA, is passed down through the maternal line. But there is a problem. Michael Spiker was adopted, so scientists have to find a sample from Spiker himself.
In this case, we went to the electric shaver, and from that electric shaver we were able to get small clippings of hair, and that was enough for us to do mitochondrial DNA sequencing. And we compared that to the tissue, and it wasn't the same.
Although the Armed Forces lab fails to make a match, in May 1991, the Pentagon officially declares Spiker killed in action.
I was a little surprised at that because our test report didn't show that he was dead. It only showed that this tissue was not Spiker.
More than 2 years after Spiker is declared KIA, a Qatari military official and his hunting party stumble upon the wreckage of an F-18 in the Iraqi desert. The official takes photographs that are sent back to Washington, along with a piece of wreckage that bears a serial number.
And from use of that serial number, we were able to positively correlate the crash site to that of Lieutenant Commander Spiker's aircraft.
Images from a U.S. satellite reveal even more.
We were able to draw the conclusions that we had a fairly intact aircraft. It was still wreckage that was 3 years old, that's been eroded by the sands of time over Iraq at that point, but we knew that we had a definable cockpit area.
And not only that, the picture shows something else. The plane's canopy lies a kilometer from the rest of the aircraft.
There's only one way that canopy is going to come off, and that's if somebody tried to eject.
The F-18 has some very interesting statistics. 90% of pilots who eject survive that ejection sequence. Was he part of the 90% or was he part of the 10%?
You get this sinking feeling that there's something really wrong here, that you missed something. Is he there? Did he get out? If he got out, where is he? What can we do to find him?
The search for answers gets underway in 1994.
The best way clearly was to get into the crash site to do a thorough excavation to recover all the information that we could.
To do that, the Pentagon develops two possible courses of action. One is diplomatic, going into Iraq under the auspices of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The other is military, a covert mission to the crash site to be carried out by U.S. Special Forces. It seems low risk.
There was nothing in this plan which suggested that there was going to be an enemy threat that was either significant or credible.
In December 1994, Secretary of Defense William Perry and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff John Shalikashvili make the decision.
The Secretary turned to the Chairman and said, "What do you think?" And the Chairman said, "I do not want to have to write letters home to the parents to tell them that their son or daughter died looking for old bones."
So the Pentagon turns to the second option, diplomacy. But another year passes before the diplomatic option, called Operation Promise Kept, finally gets underway. In December 1995, the mission codenamed Operation Promise Kept finally reaches the crash site of Michael Spiker's plane in the Iraqi desert. But investigators soon realize that the Iraqis have beaten them to it.
They found an aircraft that, in the words of the chief analyst, had been, quote, professionally excavated. The cockpit had been professionally removed. The sand in the cockpit area had been sifted.
Our assumption is that it was done by the government of Iraq, and therefore we expect answers for them on why they went there and what did they find before we got there.
Even so, the rest of the crash site remains intact.
One thing that we discovered was our original assumption that the plane had flipped over and crashed upside down was not true, that the plane had actually crashed in an upright position.
They also find some other intriguing clues, including Spiker's flight suit.
The flight suit has no vegetation under it. It has no moisture under it. Looks like you had just taken it off and thrown it on the desert floor 10 or 15 minutes before. So there was no doubt in anyone's mind on that team that the flight suit had been planted or placed in that position that day.
The team also discovers one of the plane's black boxes in a Bedouin scrap pile. They buy it from the Bedouins. After analyzing the flight data recorder, investigators come to a startling conclusion.
It was very carefully worded that there was the sequence of ejection was successfully completed.
Yet, despite the findings, the Pentagon concludes the crash site offers no evidence that Spiker survived. So, in 1996, it declares him killed in action a second time. That does not satisfy two U.S. Senators, Rod Grams of Minnesota and Bob Smith of New Hampshire.
All the letters back from the Pentagon were blunt, referring to remains, like, butt out, what do you hear? We're handling this, we got it under control. When in fact, they had information all along that he may have survived the incident, and they still classify him as KIA.
So the two senators ask the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to investigate. Then, in May 2000, the CBS News magazine 60 Minutes 2 reveals new information from an Iraqi defector. The broadcast quotes him as saying that in 1991, he had driven an American pilot alive in his flight suit to authorities in Baghdad. Shown a photo lineup, the defector immediately points to Spiker. That kind of information prods the Senate to ask the Pentagon and the CIA for answers.
I think the country deserves to know. And I have no information, I'll tell you right up front. I can't sit here and tell you that Spiker's alive, and I can't sit here and tell you that he's dead.
As a result of the prodding and new information, Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig takes the unprecedented step in January 2001 of changing Spiker's status from KIA to MIA. That makes the Navy pilot the first American casualty of the Persian Gulf War and the last serviceman unaccounted for.
We have some evidence that what had been assumed to be the evidence that he was lost in action is not so. And we're going to do our best to find out if he is alive, and if he is, to get him out.
Reclassified as MIA, the fate of Michael Spiker remains unknown.
I think that if you can't say with certainty that he is dead, then you must operate with certainty that he is alive.
Saddam Hussein continually blocks us and prevents us from gaining any other information that would allow us to rule out one scenario or rule in another scenario. So until that happens, until he decides to provide us the kinds of information we need from him, we will continue to explore every possibility.
The refusal of men like Leota and Connolly to give up trying to find out exactly what happened to Spiker is the legacy of an earlier war.
I look back at the Vietnam guys, and I see the POW MIA flags. And it never meant anything to me, but it does now. And there is an obligation, I think, to these heroes that, you feel it. Get his bones, find out what happened to him.
That same question continues to hang over the almost 2,000 servicemen still classified as missing in action from the Vietnam War.
Most of the people lost in North Vietnam were pilots, and the pilots were better educated, and they came from, more wealth and more political influence.
These are your men.
And they began to organize in the early 1970s.
The campaign for the POWs and MIAs caught on nationwide. It was an issue that even people who disagreed with America's participation in the war could support.
By conservative counts, over 50 million people in our country have participated in campaigns expressing concern for these men.
By the early 1970s, 5 million Americans were wearing bracelets inscribed with the names of MIAs. An organization of POW and MIA families created a special flag that bears the words, "You are not forgotten." It was the only flag to fly beside the Stars and Stripes at the White House.
All of our American POWs are on their way home.
The nationwide campaign seemed to pay off when the U.S. signed a peace agreement with North Vietnam in January 1973. But Hanoi released only 591 American POWs out of the estimated 3,200 listed as missing in action in Southeast Asia.
It was my sense, and I think it was a sense of most people involved and most people at the policy level, that we would at some point in the future receive an additional number of Americans returning.
The world should know that this administration.
It wasn't until the election of Ronald Reagan that the issue of the missing moved to the government's front burner. Reagan sent the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Vesey, to Hanoi in late 1987 as his special emissary. Vesey brought a so-called discrepancy list of 196 MIA cases that he hoped the Vietnamese would help resolve.
The 196 cases were selected on the fact that those cases would most likely be the cases that the Vietnamese could reasonably account for.
Search operations with the Vietnamese continued through the rest of the 80s. In January 1992, the effort was turned over to a new Department of Defense office called the Joint Task Force Full Accounting.
If you remember, there were many movies about unaccounted for being over there, the Rambo movies. A lot of these movies portrayed Americans still being held prisoner, and that was the top priority for Joint Task Force Full Accounting, and that was one of the key reasons that we were formed.
In 1991, shortly after the birth of his son Robert, John McDonnell started looking for answers about what happened to his father, an Army helicopter pilot who had disappeared in Vietnam in March 1969.
Just something internally came over me that said at some point in this guy's life he was going to ask me about my dad. So I thought it'd be good to investigate and find out more about my dad, and so I could answer his questions.
John's father, Army Captain John Terrence McDonnell, was serving his third tour of duty in Vietnam, attached to the Aerial Rocket Artillery Unit of the 101st Airborne Division. His previous tours had been with Special Forces, where McDonnell had received extensive training in survival techniques.
I never flew with him, but I can tell you I sure wanted to. John would be invaluable if anything happened and you were shot down.
In late December 1968, McDonnell was home for the last time.
He left probably a few days before my 7th birthday. And it was a dark day, you know, the middle of winter is pretty dark, and so he was leaving in the evening to fly out. So I remember him closing the door and walking away, so that was it.
On March 6, 1969, McDonnell, along with fellow pilot Lieutenant Ronald Greenfield, was on a mission to take out some enemy mortar sites southeast of the ancient imperial city of Hue. The weather was marginal.
It was really a bad day. It was really a bad day. Where we flew in Vietnam was lots of mountains, and that day the fog and the clouds had gone almost all the way down to the ground.
Suddenly, McDonnell's helicopter took enemy fire and crashed into the side of a mountain. A search and rescue operation was immediately mounted to find the missing men.
We were back on Camp Eagle, and I was notified that the ARA aircraft had gone down, and the two people in there were Ron Greenfield and John McDonnell, and I knew them because I had been in their unit previously, and I asked if I could take that mission.
But in the fog and dense jungle terrain, no one could find the downed helicopter.
And I remember a sinking feeling in my stomach that we weren't able to find the aircraft or both pilots, and they may not survive the night.
It wasn't until the next afternoon that Bob Black's medevac team found McDonnell's crash site, with a seriously injured Ron Greenfield lying next to the chopper, but no sign of John.
John's helmet was in the aircraft, but no signs of any trauma in his part of the cockpit or blood or anything. So it assumed that possibly he got out with rather minor injuries. I remember thinking that he would escape and evade on his own towards the coast in what's called Highway 1.
For 20 days, the search for Captain McDonnell continued.
Lots of aircraft time, people put on the ground. It was an exhaustive search of that area. John McDonnell was never found.
His family believed he had been taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese.
But after 1973, and he didn't come back during Operation Homecoming, then what else can you think? Nixon said all the POWs that are alive are back. By then, we'd pretty much given up that there was any hope of him being alive.
So in 1977, 8 years after his disappearance, Becky McDonald had her husband declared legally dead.
She asked where I thought that we ought to put his gravestone. So I thought, well, we were living in Mojave, California at the time, and it didn't make much sense to put it out there. He was from Fort Worth. I didn't know anybody from Fort Worth, so it didn't make much sense to put it over there. And he had the option of being in Arlington, so we put the headstone in Arlington.
His mother remarried, and the family moved on. Then, in the early 90s, John requested a copy of his father's casualty file. When the 2-foot stack of papers arrived, John realized the government had a special interest in the case.
The McDonald case is one of the cases that was on General Vesey's discrepancy case list, the 196 last known alive list.
But as he started going through the reports, John was surprised at the inconsistencies.
There's a lot of information there that was really ambiguous, and you really couldn't tell what happened.
Witnesses told Bill Bell they saw an American soldier near the crash site who was severely wounded while resisting arrest. The North Vietnamese captured the man and was taking him to communist headquarters.
And he died en route. And then they buried his body in a shallow grave on a stream bank on the slope of a hill. And then later on, the body washed away, and there's no evidence of, or no remains left.
Other witnesses led investigators to different locations where they said John McDonald was buried.
We've done excavations in 2 particular sites, and we're not able to find remains at either one of them.
It's very unusual not to find at least some evidence of a burial at a burial site. We did not find any snaps, any buttons, a pocket comb, a lighter, any personal effects, or any indication that anyone was ever buried there.
Other documents John discovered in his father's file were even more curious. They led to another trail, one of live or bright light sightings, named after a wartime program designed to illuminate the issue. In 1971, a North Vietnamese defector made a bright light sighting in a POW camp in Laos. He gave a description of a man who resembled Captain McDonald.
One of the prisoners was 30 years old, at 1.8 meters tall. He weighed about 90 kilos. He says he has a heavy build, a pink complexion, a long face, short brownish blonde hair.
Another bright light sighting, one that makes the most sense to former investigator Bell, was reported in 1973 by another defector,
who said he saw a captain who was an artillery captain, and his name was John, and he was from Texas, and he was married and had 2 children, and he had an 1.5 inch scar over his left ear. That particular witness saw him in Quang Ai province, where he was said to be teaching artillery to an artillery unit of the communists. Under threat of execution is the way that the witness described it.
Then, in 1991, investigators came across Captain McDonald's ID in a military museum in Hue. According to museum records, it had been there since 1975, 2 years after all POWs had presumably come home.
It shows that he was in the Vietnamese hands in some form or fashion. The real question is, what did they do with him?
I don't have no idea what happened to Captain McDonald. But personally, I don't think we had enough evidence to declare Captain McDonald dead, no.
For its part, the Joint Task Force is still trying to resolve the case.
There needs to be some good detective work on it, and there hasn't been. If my dad is alive, if he were alive, he'd be 60 years old today.
Dave Shoup, who served with McDonald in Vietnam, makes an annual pilgrimage to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. There, at a kiosk that sells MIA bracelets, he bought one with McDonald's name on it. He says it helps him deal with the fact that McDonald's fate remains unresolved.
10% of the time, I like to think I'm being realistic, and I try and talk myself out of the fact that John McDonald is alive. But 90% of the time, when I think about him and how he was trained, I will always think that if anyone could survive, it would be him.
For years, former Marine Lance Corporal Larry Barnett has been haunted by what happened to 3 of his fellow Marines, Joseph Hargrove, Gary Hall, and Danny Marshall on May 15, 1975. They may have been left behind alive during their mission to rescue the crew of the SS Mayaguez from a small island off Cambodia.
Marines don't leave their own behind, and that's probably one of the weighing factors that never leaves your head. It never does. There's not a day that I have been out of bed and went on with my life that they're not there.
What draws the Marines to that island begins just 12 days after the fall of Saigon on May 12, 1975, when the Khmer Rouge seizes the American merchant ship, the SS Mayaguez, in international waters and takes its 39 crewmen hostage. With American credibility at stake, President Gerald Ford orders a rescue mission by U.S. Marines. American military intelligence believes the crew is being held on Koh Tang Island, some 30 miles off the coast of Cambodia. Enemy resistance on the island is expected to be light.
The final aerial photos from the U-2s came in within minutes before we took off on the assault. When I saw the aerial photos, I looked over at the gunny and I said, "Gunny, I'm not even going to show this to the troops, but we're in for a world of trouble." The whole island had been set up for defense.
The assault begins in the early morning hours of May 15th.
When the helicopters came in and started backing in to unload the troops, that's when they opened up.
Even as the Marines are fighting for their lives on Koh Tang Island, the Khmer Rouge releases the 39 Mayaguez crewmen unharmed at another location.
At that particular point, it didn't make a hill of beans in the situation that I was in. The only thing that I was thinking about was how to stay alive.
It isn't until nightfall, hours later, that Air Force helicopters can reach the stranded Marines.
We're coming, man, we're coming. How many people are you going to have left? I just don't know. It's dark out here. I don't know who's going and who's here. I'm going to just have to do the best I can.
The extraction was incrementally done. Myself and the gunnery sergeant decided that we would be the last group to leave the island.
Captain Davis on night 5-1 advises that all Marines are off the island. Okay, outstanding. That's exactly what we're looking for.
But in the fog of battle, 3 Marines from another company, Joseph Hargrove, Gary Hall, and Danny Marshall, never make it to the helicopters. In fact, Marines see one of the men alive on the beach just 10 minutes before the last chopper takes off. A roll call held on board the Coral Sea a day and a half later reveals that Company E's machine gun team is missing.
What makes me feel so bad about the whole situation is I was the last commander on the island. So regardless of who those Marines belong to, I still share the guilt of those missing Marines.
At the time, Gail Hargrove has been married to her husband Joseph for only 33 days when the Marine Corps comes to her door in North Carolina with the news.
Next thing I knew, I just sort of faded. You know, I thought it was a dream. So I just got up and walked outside. And then the next day, of course, they send you a telegram.
Soon after the mission, the Pentagon tries to close the book on the whole affair.
We were just given instructions that we were not to discuss the operation with anybody, and that if we discussed the operation, we were doing so under the penalty of court-martial.
For Gail Hargrove, however, it is far from over.
The first 3 or 4 months, I sit around, I wouldn't even leave the house. I got to stay here because he'll be back.
But 14 months after the Mayaguez operation in July of 1976, the 3 missing men are officially declared killed in action. Finally, Gail Hargrove's stepfather urges her to move on.
He said that if you're sitting around waiting for that boy, if you're sitting around waiting for that boy to walk back in your life, you are wasting your time. Because it was a bad day, a real bad day.
Over the years, speculation grows about the fate of the missing Marines.
I worry about the worst scenario, the fact that they could have survived for days, they could have been captured.
The rescue of the crew of the Mayaguez.
In a speech on POW MIA Recognition Day in 1997, Senator John McCain singles them out.
Among the casualties was one Marine fire team which was mistakenly left behind, almost certainly alive, the details of whose fate we do not know, but who probably continued to fight for days, even weeks, before all trace of them disappeared.
All the while, Larry Barnett also searches for answers.
I told my wife, probably back in May or June at that point, I said, I feel like I need to go back to the island.
So in October 2000, Barnett, along with 3 of his fellow Marines, returns to the island for the first time in 25 years.
Since I'm on the East Beach, where we went in at. One of the ideas to the forefront, find out what happened to that crew. Do I believe we found out? Yes, I do.
They talked to the battalion commander out on the site, an individual who said he had information on the case.
And we had a very good hour interview with him, the focus of which was the machine gun team. The best that we understand, one had been wounded, evidently in the leg, and he couldn't go with the other 2. He stayed there and fought and was probably killed on the island. The other 2 were captured a few days later, taken to the mainland, and questioned, and after they were questioned, they were executed.
The Joint Task Force also interviews the same man, known as M. San.
We got all the information that he had, and we've actually, as a result of that, we went out and excavated one of the sites on Koh Tang Island, and to date we have not found any remains that we believe are those individuals. So the search goes on.
Well, for years, you think, well, hopefully he's alive, and then you think, no, you wouldn't want that. And you go from that to trying not to think about it, and then I just decided the best thing to do was pray him to heaven.
In November 2000, President Bill Clinton becomes the first American president to visit Vietnam since the end of the war. 5 years earlier, in 1995, Clinton restores full diplomatic relations with Vietnam, despite strong opposition from some MIA families.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
That may be one reason the president visits a joint task force recovery operation in a rice paddy outside Hanoi.
At this spot, 33 years ago this month, Captain Lawrence Everett's F-105 was shot down. No parachute was seen, the area was heavily defended, and there was no chance for a search. Today I am honored to be here with Captain Everett's sons, Dan and David, and I thank them for coming.
That meant a lot to us, that our father's crash site was chosen and that we were able to take place in a very personal way. It made a big difference to us.
We believe we owe them and all Americans like them what they came here for, a chance finally to take their father home.
At the site, the Everetts hope to find the remains of their father, who has been missing since 1967.
It's very tough to go through that many years, and you just don't know.
Our nation has made a commitment that we will not rest until we have achieved the fullest possible accounting for our lost veterans.
Later, at a press conference, David Everett recalls the last time he saw his father.
I was 6 years old. We were at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport as he walked up the stairs to get onto the plane, and he turned and he waved to us. That was the last time that we saw our father.
On November 8, 1967, Captain Everett was flying in a formation of 4 F-105s on a bombing run against a railroad bridge approximately 17 miles northwest of Hanoi.
His aircraft was struck and he went down, but the aircraft that saw his plane crashed did not see any ejection or any evidence that Captain Everett was able to get out of the aircraft before they saw the crash.
They didn't say he was killed. It was basically that he was missing. And I'm not sure at 8 years old I understood what missing meant.
I think it was just, as a little child, you think of someone being lost as, well, what does that mean? He's around the corner and he doesn't know how to get home, or so I looked at it a different way as a little boy.
Still, for years, his family believed he would return home safely.
We were under the impression that a parachute beeper went off as his plane went down. And he was on the radio, and they did hear him say that he was hit hard. That gave us some hope that maybe he made it out of the plane, was a prisoner, and would be able to come home.
That hope was dashed in March of 1973 when 591 POWs returned to American soil. Captain Lawrence Everett was not among them.
We had already been told that my father wasn't part of that, but we stayed up watching the TV, just hoping and praying that we would recognize him there. And it was pretty devastating to watch the last plane come in, the last prisoners get off of the plane, and him not be part of that.
So, in 1978, the military declared Captain Everett dead, and that November, the family held a memorial service for him.
At that point, we thought that might be the only closure that we would ever get.
But 33 years later, in the fall of 2000, representatives of the Department of Defense paid them an unexpected visit.
It was a family conference, and it had a story, and a place, and pictures. And it's very difficult to express in words how much a little bit of information really helps. It created an excitement in me, and I think within our family. Through the discussion, we were able to see a little bit of a story. They showed us pictures of a crash site and gave us a story of what they would have to do to start an excavation.
But excavating Captain Everett's crash site won't be easy. Not only is it located right next to a railroad, there is a major power line running nearby.
So we actually shored up the embankment of the railroad as part of our preparation for the site. A technical assessment team went out and figured out exactly how we could reroute the power.
They also have to drain the rice paddy and sweep the area for any unexploded ordnance before the site is finally ready for excavation in the fall of 2000. President Clinton plans to visit the site that November.
And it was determined at the highest levels that they wanted to take the Everett family out there.
And for us to be able to participate in that was really just a great blessing in my life.
When the presidential party arrives, the recovery operation has just begun. The search team is turning up very little.
There was a lot of little bits and pieces of the plane. Most of them would be dime, nickel, quarter-size pieces of plane, wire, different things.
Then we were able to find a data plate. We were able to identify that this was actually from an F-105 Delta. That is the type of aircraft that Captain Everett was in. So with this small data plate, we were able to make a big discovery and know that we were at least the right type of aircraft site.
Soon, the crater begins to give up even more secrets, like the remains of these .38 caliber casings.
This told us also that the occupant of the aircraft was carrying a .38 weapon. The .38 is the hand weapon issued to aviators during the Vietnam conflict.
Still, they have no proof that someone was in the aircraft at the time of the crash.
But we were pretty confident that someone was in the aircraft once we found the boot sole. We found a sole of a boot. On the inscription of the boot, you can see the numbers 1-3. We assume that's the size of the boot.
By the end of November's joint field activity, the search team still has a lot more work to do. Even so, the Everetts believe their father's remains will ultimately be found.
I left there that day with a great feeling. And And I felt that that was Dad's final place where he had gone down.
So that's where Dad's crash site was?
That is the crash site, so Hanoi.
The brothers were so moved by what they saw that they took other family members out during the last joint field activity.
In March 2001, Dan Everett returns to the site, this time with his sisters, Tammy and Liz. Liz has never known her father. She was born just 5 days after he was shot down. By now, the crater is much larger and deeper.
And we could see a lot more airplane parts than what we were able to see the first time. So we were under the impression very quickly that they were finding a lot more.
Like some mysterious material that Everett's daughters help identify.
It's fragments of a religious undergarment worn by Mormons. And the daughters were able to actually show me, they laid it out and were actually able to show me where the seams joined together and the edges of the material where it's finished. And one of the daughters was able to show me her garment and actually compare.
We had been told right before we went that they were finding human remains. And so when we got there on site, we immediately asked if we could see them or if they were there, and they were. And so that was probably the most important thing for me. Was to see my father. Even if he wasn't alive, it was just important to me to see as much of him as I can.
And for me, it also means that my father didn't have to suffer through any of the effects of the war, of parachuting out, being a prisoner, that he went down with a plane, and that he died very quickly.
For the Everetts, final closure must wait until the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii completes the forensic analysis.
When we're able to go and bring him home from Hawaii after they've done the testing, and that will be bringing Dad home. That's what I want, and that's what I look forward to.
In fact, the Central Identification Laboratory was able to identify Captain Everett's remains in January of 2002. His two sons, David and Dan, flew to Honolulu in early July to escort the remains of their father home. He was buried with full military honors on July 6th in Chandler, Arizona. That still leaves nearly 2,000 Americans classed in Southeast Asia. For the History Channel, I'm Arthur Kent. Thanks for watching.